After the initial surprise attack by the North Koreans, the Americans quickly and accurately reported that an all-out offensive was occurring against the Republic of Korea. This took Washington completely off guard. Much like Pearl Harbor, they knew that the North Koreans had the capability to attack, but they had inadequate awareness of the situation. The South, however, were expecting a North Korean attack and desperately requested more support from the Americans. The North, with help from the USSR, had been increasing arms, training and support for communist guerrilla forces in the South. Just 5 days before the attack, the North Koreans also declared the Southern government traitors and called for the reunification of military and security forces. Some information was sent into Washington that indicated an attack at the end of June, but this didn't reach the right people in time. The US dismissed the threat from the North and didn't sufficiently consider their aggression. It was thought that the Communists would not want to force a confrontation on the Korean peninsula. Furthermore, the supplies that the US had already given, enough to arm 65,000 men, was mistakenly believed to be a sufficient deterrent for an invasion. None of the sources mention this, but I further suspect that the US believed that the South was using an exaggerated threat of invasion to strengthen its position. When the US supplied enough equipment for 50,000 men, the South increased its military forces to 65,000 and asked for more. When the US granted equipment for 15,000 more men, the South rapidly increased its forces to 100,000 men and again asked for more. This equipment wasn't cheap. Arming 50,000 more men in 1949, as the South Koreans requested, would cost the US $110 million. In comparison, the fund authorized to address equipment shortfalls for the US Army itself was $250 million. This armament could have been interpreted by the Communist bloc as an offensive measure. Both Koreas wanted reunification, and South Korea could have invaded the North and pushed to the border with China and the USSR, possibly bringing them directly into conflict. The US therefore wanted South Korea to have enough of a military to provide security against communist guerrillas and deter invasion, but not enough to threaten North Korea. Another part of this defensive stance would be the absence of South Korean air and naval power. Tanks were also dismissed as ineffective in the poorly paved Korean countryside. The US overestimated South Korean military capabilities, assessing that supplies would last 2 months when the South Korean command protested that it would only last 2 days. All of these weaknesses put the South at a significant disadvantage and would later be displayed in the first days of the Korean War. The offensive had begun at 4 a.m. on the 25th of June, Korean time. This was 3 p.m. on the 24th of June in New York. At 2 p.m. on the 25th of June, New York time, the UN unanimously passed a resolution to demand the withdrawal of North Korean forces. This was only possible as the USSR was boycotting the UN, and China's seat belonged to the American-aligned Republic of China rather than Communist China. In the evening of the 25th of June, President Truman authorized General MacArthur in Tokyo to send equipment and supplies to Korea, to evacuate American dependents, and to send the 7th Fleet from the Philippines and Okinawa to Sasebo near Nagasaki. On the 26th of June, Washington put MacArthur in charge of all US military forces in Korea. On the 27th of June, MacArthur was given the authority to use air and naval power to repel North Korean forces below the 38th parallel. On the 28th of June, when the North Koreans were in Seoul, the UN called on its members to help stop the attack. On the same day, the 6th Division crossed the Han River to the Kimpo airfield. The 3rd and 4th Divisions were delayed, finding and executing South Korean soldiers and policemen in Seoul. It must be kept in mind that the North Koreans did not consider ROK combatants as foreign prisoners of war, but rather criminals acting against their own country. On the 29th of June, MacArthur went to the Han River and saw the desperate situation firsthand. He requested immediate American ground support in South Korea. The next day, on the 30th of June, President Truman granted this, but only to secure ports and air bases around the southeastern tip, and he granted the use of air and naval forces to target North Korea itself, but to stay clear of China and Russia. The plan was to protect the supply route for the ROK army and to give air and naval firepower that the South Koreans lacked, but without bringing the USSR or Communist China into the war. On the same day, men of the 3rd Division crossed on boats or waded across the river with support from artillery and tank fire. The day after, the 4th Division crossed the river, but without armoured support suffered much heavier casualties. The Han River line was now broken. American ground troops were authorised to extend their reach beyond the southeastern tip. Task Force Smith of the 24th Infantry Division would be the first American ground troops to see action. They held the area north of Osan in a new defensive position. They set up overlooking the road and the railway. When the North Korean column arrived, the tanks at the front were met with artillery fire. At closer range, recoilless rifles fired and achieved direct hits. However, both of these measures were ineffective. When the tanks reached the infantry positions, bazookas, rockets and anti-tank rounds opened fire and damaged 3 tanks. The 30 remaining tanks didn't engage the infantry and pushed on to the artillery. The tanks were followed by a large number of infantry that significantly outnumbered the Americans. Machine gun and mortar fire rendered a frontal assault impossible, and the North Koreans moved to outflank the US position. With infantry at their flanks, tanks in their rear, more reserves coming frontally and running short of ammunition, Task Force Smith decided to retreat. However, with the North Koreans so close, the Americans suffered most of their casualties on the withdrawal. Dead and wounded soldiers were left behind, along with crew-served equipment like mortars and machine guns. The Americans lost 180 men, whereas the North Koreans lost around half that number. The first battle fought by US ground forces was unsuccessful. However, with more men and materiel arriving from abroad, the UN forces would get stronger and stronger. With the North Koreans on a seemingly unstoppable advance, the question would be whether the Korean peninsula could be held long enough for these reinforcements to arrive.